it's time in the morning, like rougher.
Everybody's here.
Been a lot of times.
One handful of cereal. Quick class. The second portion of this session is about so that's going to get down to the weeds pretty quick. But that presenter is not here yet. So why don't we start with Kristi talking about some of the great stuff that they've done wirelessly and
I'm here to, unless, can you hear me? So I'm here to talk about the wireless internet at the Dimock Memorial Library in Coventry. For those of you unfamiliar, we're a small library serving about 12,000 people. And for some unknown reason that predated when I got there, the last director of the library decided that she was very concerned about security with the network, all of the hardware vendors were on that happens to be the same network that the schools and the town share. So she said, well, we should have Wi-Fi, and she went and got a home Wi-Fi connection from Charter, which did not support the needs of the library, for sure. But we did make it managed for several years. But we had problems. Limited numbers to be on it at a given time. It worked out okay sometimes, but especially when we had high volume days, such as when we had the big storms and everyone would come to the library because no one had power to charge, no one could get on the Wi-Fi. Everyone was getting kicked off. So that was a big problem. We had a lot of unreliable connectivity. I did a test for about 30 days to see how many times we had to manually reset the router, and about 44% of the time, every day we needed to reset. That was a huge time constraint for staff, especially it's in the basement, storage closet. Only a couple of people, were willing to go do it and thought they knew how. And then based on the structure and construction of our building, we've been added onto, so there's brick walls in the middle, there's a concrete floor. Only certain areas of the building were getting that Wi-Fi. And those were not the areas where we most needed it, such as the only quiet study rooms we had available, quiet areas, or our program room. So we had really no security there for Wi-Fi. So we wanted to run a program such as Skyping with an author or any other such thing. I've actually used my phone as a mobile hotspot in order to make sure that program went off because we couldn't use our Wi-Fi. Looking at statistics, our best guess for how many people were using that or how many people came up to us and asked how to get onto it. We'd make a little tally on a piece of paper, or we'd walk around and see how many people had a laptop at any given moment. So definitely very accurate. And then our biggest problem was security. We did have a permission form that they would sign when we would give them the Wi-Fi password, just to be like, hey, you agreed to not do anything stupid or bad on this public wireless network. But we were still getting those notices in the mail that people were downloading copyright protected items. There were a lot of people who couldn't figure out how to put that password in, so all of a sudden we were going on personal devices and setting it up. So things that we really didn't want to be doing. So I was chatting with Scott and Bryn at one point, telling them about what our problems were with wireless, and they said, hey, we've got this great idea, something that we want to test out in the library. So they came over and they walked around our library, that's our building in the street, and they figured out how many wireless devices we needed, where we needed them. There's pictures of them over on the left. You can see even in the very historic parts of our building, they were very intrusive, which was a big concern, especially over there. And so, like I said, they came in and installed it, and all of a sudden, everything was better. We no longer had problems with people who couldn't connect. They completely understood how to get on. There were no areas of the building where we had any trouble. All of a sudden, we have statistics. We know how many people are using it, when, what days. We don't have to worry about when there's a big rush on the library I really care about, we can tell just how many people are, like these little drops here on like March 27th, those are the days we're closed, but it's not every day we're closed, so we can still see there's a bunch of people using the wireless from the parking lot when we're closed, which is something we thought, but had no way to track. And I believe our tally system, I was actually impressed. We guessed for the same period that I'm showing here, we had 143 users, so we were only off by a little bit, but still, you know. And then this is another set of statistics that I just thought was really impressive. From what I've gathered, it has nothing to do with who's actually connected to our network, but who's come by the library, how many people come regularly, how many people are close by. So I just, if there's someone out there who can really delve into it, that kind of information has been really very interesting. I know my board was thrilled when they got to see something like this. I mentioned our splash page agreement several times. I'm sure you all know what one looks like, but it's really taken a lot of time for us. And one of the other big things we've done is we have a lot of library mobile devices. So in addition to all these patrons we had coming in who wanted to be on our network, we had a bunch of devices that were connected to that home charter network. And I'm showing you here an image because I really like that I can just whitelist those. They don't have to go on through the general, you know, I agree every time. And if I could notice that someone was really abusing it, I could block them, which is also very nice. Other things that we have found to be beneficial, we've actually been able to set up a wireless printing in the library, which is something that previous wireless would not support. And as I mentioned before, it's really saved a lot of staff time. So that's kind of been our anecdotal experiences with this Wi-Fi pilot, which we're thrilled with.
What kind of questions do you folks have for Kristi? I mean, from our perspective, one of the best things, we didn't like helping them with this. We wanted to have some experience with what problems libraries were having with providing wireless access. So it's a great learning experience for my team. And one of the best things about it is we basically helped them stand it up, give them a little bit of training on it for very little amount of time. And then we never hear from Kristi or her staff. I mean, it just, they go in and they figured out all this stuff themselves. They went in there, put their policy and splash page up, and it was just so simple that they were able to do their own with no burden on CEN stuff.
But the few times I have had to call.
What kind of problems did you discover as a part of the implementation?
So when we first deployed it, we were pretty conservative, and we put in only a couple of access points. And we looked back and we did a walkthrough survey and see how the deployment worked and where the wireless signal was, and make sure we had enough capacity. And then it worked throughout the whole footprint of the library, but we wanted it to work really well. And so I think we have a total of 4 access points in our library. 2 floors. It's an interesting library where part of the building is an older building that's brick and wood floors, and so the signal would penetrate through the wood floor just fine. But we've got bricks, the original facade, and go into the back of the library. So there's some, consideration we gave to that, but we ended up with 4 access points and a big library like that, a decent sized library, and provides really good coverage. That was the biggest challenge for us. Kristi was great and very accommodating with getting us access to help with the cablings. It was just a really good partnership. We've learned a lot. I didn't help with
Could you speak a little louder so that us in the cheap seats can hear? And secondly, how did you address the problem of illegal downloads?
Well, we talked about it for a while. We talked about filtering that site, but we really didn't want to start that as a practice. And we found that we are making people use that splash page user agreement. And while we were asking people to sign a paper permission form previous to that, people were sharing the password amongst their friends, so people weren't necessarily doing it. And our hope is that with this, every week they have to click I agree to not be stupid. That just kind of reminds them and makes them think, oh, well, we're checking up on you, something has changed. So,
are you actually tracking if anybody does that?
I'm not tracking, but I haven't gotten any notices.
Okay, we've been getting notices.
And we forward those on whenever we get them to folks.
On the signing case, are you using this on the whole building? Are you using access point for connectivity? Or is it all hardwired?
Hardwired. They had a town electrician that ran the cable, all power over Ethernet, so we didn't need, I think they're older access points, you actually have power, so there's something next to it, don't shut the bill, and these are professional mounted power over Ethernet, so it's a little easier to reboot without climbing a ladder, plug and play it in.
Oh yeah, I did mention that. We have to drag a ladder from the basement and climb it in the middle of the library. Back there.
Did you have any problem with buy-in in terms of spending the extra money? I'm assuming that the newer system was a little bit of an expense up front. Did you guys have any trouble selling that to the board or to the director or anything?
She's looking at me because she's like, how do I answer this one? So we, CEN paid for access points and licensing because we looked at it, we had some year funds, and I used it as an opportunity for my staff to learn from this. So we said to Kristi, as long as you agree to come to a conference and present and share the value that you've gotten from doing some of these infrastructure upgrades, and you're willing to work through this, and it might not work flawlessly all the time, no promises. It's a learning experience for us. As long as you agree to those terms, I'll cover the access points. If I recall, it was under $2,500 for a 5-year deployment of this. I think that might have included the access points that went in our office as well. So it wasn't a huge investment, but definitely something to plan for a budget. I don't know how you would address it.
Well, it depends on the cost. We were paying for the charter Wi-Fi, and that was hard to justify too. They kept increasing those rates, and we were getting more service. So when you put that towards it, that helps.
These are, for this deployment, we read the Rockies that were 42s. So the screenshots that Kristi had here were, it's a cloud controller. She logged into the web page. We have it set up as a multi-tenant type environment. So CEN can actually see, pull down, and get in and see that all 4 controllers are online in there. Frankly, we never do because we don't have time. And Kristi's group has been on top of this, so we haven't had to. We're able to set the library, our organization. So if she called us for help, we could get in there and take a look at people and tell her without logging out, logging back in, her credentials. But it's others.
What's the square footage of your compound?
About 12 months.
I'm really curious to put one of the outdoor MPPs facing your park
They are. Some of those days are Sundays. There are people.
Now that CEN is an E-rate provider, is it something that library schools as applicants could put out to bid and have you guys bid on?
Certainly, and we're using this experience to, so if everybody heard the question, CEN changed from being an E-rate applicant to an E-rate service provider. Wireless is an eligible E-rate Category 2 type service. So if a library was to do an E-rate application for Category 2 funding for wireless upgrades, I can't remember exactly all the details about how much money you get over a 5-year period, but it's truly enough to do a deployment like this. We could certainly, we've been having some conversations with not just Meraki, but some of the other wireless vendors about looking at maybe helping with reselling that, managing, offering managed service, wireless services. Big caveat with that one is they do require no filter, whereas this one we didn't use federal dollars, not using E-rate dollars for it. We just bought the equipment license, and Kristi does not have to filter on it. If you use E-rate, you would have to filter. After 5 years, the way Meraki does these, they turn into a brick. Unless you relicense it. So how much the license? That's a good question. I don't know. It would be, each access point was $500 or something, and the license was $300 or something like that before discount for a 5-year license. So I think the idea is you could relicense these, but I think wireless is the newest version of wireless standard 10 gig to
Sorry, could you talk a bit about the wireless printing, and how easy that was to deploy?
I'm laughing. We've had a wireless printer for a couple of years, and we've been trying to hook it up to our pre-existing wireless connection. We were always told it just wasn't strong enough, and we couldn't get a connection, and no one would be able to print to it. So when we installed this, we played around with whitelisting our printers and other devices, and then all of a sudden, we were working on trying to set this up, and I kept sending something from my phone to the printer, and nothing was coming out, and nothing was coming out. I thought I was printing to the neighbors, and I wasn't sure. And then we found another printer that we didn't even know was a wireless printer, and it was just spitting out, so surprisingly easy. Not what we intended to do at all, but it seems to be working, at least from Apple devices. We haven't figured out anything else yet.
See the 5-year-old. They're trying to neighborhood 5-year-old figure it out.
Yes.
Just one thing we do, I think we use bridges for mobile printers, so printers will little bridges move it around. So I don't have to worry about being stationed.
So I haven't looked to see before and after how much bandwidth. There's some bandwidth across the wireless only. They do have some wireless workstations in the library. The Commons Recovery, they actually have their own connection to the school where we provide service. So they're on a fiber-based solution right now. We haven't charged public libraries and K-12s to date. Going forward next fiscal year with the budget unknown, we've proposed that will be how we continue to operate. But we're not certain how that's going to work out. We'll have some clarity in the next couple of weeks. Right now, we have a limited connection from the library back to the school. We're looking to the CEN. They haven't had a pay for that.
These fiber, who's fiber to the school for the library? Family fiber?
The town is leasing it, but there is a project right now with CEN and the state library and E-rate that we should be getting from the library. Ready in the next fiscal year.
Yeah, so Kristi was actually the first to file her E-rate 471 and sign on to build construct fiber from the library back to the high school to replace that lease circuit with a circuit that the library will own for 20 years. So it varies depending on distance. We can certainly work with you offline to figure out your specific situation and introduce you to a couple different options that would be most cost effective in your situation.
So does that mean that you're gonna have to filter now?
No. Because, and I think I've got a handle on this, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But because of the agreement and the state funds, we're still going to be responsible, or the state library is covering the library portion of the libraries that won't filter. So for the install, thank you, Maria.
Yeah, E-rate will cover the special construction costs without having to filter or be CEQA compliant, but anything that does require filtering or compliance, the state will pay for it.
So we'll probably see and will help with some of the E-rate idiosyncrasies and a future probably monthly workshop that we could do. But you kind of get down into the weeds of the exact language of the E-rate rules and what's allowed and what's not allowed to be filtered. Telecommunication circuits do not require filtering. They're built strictly as like a point-to-point type connection. Some of the fiber special construction costs don't require filtering. So we're carefully navigating those waters to make sure we abide by the USAC FCC rules.
The least connection we have now, we can't use E-rate for it.
Is there any way to learn more about that here at this conference today? If it's literally time that we have left?
You can chat with Maria and ask her who's very good at that. Thank you, Maria. So this is the library portion of our panel, our session, and it's a unique session where we go from, hey, this is really some really cool stuff that we've done with wireless to something also very important, but also a lot more technical, and that's Internet Protocol version 6. Now we have Peter Southwick with Integration Partners and an expert on IPv6 to kind of get down into the weeds on why you need to know what IPv version 6 is, and kind of educate us a little bit on how we migrate to that. If that's a little too in the weeds for you, it's going to be hurt. But we're going to get very technical real quick, I'm sure.
And if you want to plug out of this, make sure you come back to the cocktail. Integration Partners sponsored the cocktail. Just had to put that plug in. Looking at my use of fonts here, a little bit of a different piece. I don't know, can you hear me in the back? No.
Yeah.
No? Okay, I'll use the iPad.
Sounds like it's on.
First thing we've heard all day, Scott.
Earlier this morning, Scott said that Aaron announced that the last of the IPv4 addresses had been released, had been assigned. And that is very much of a true statement. And Aaron, from their page, has a why should I adopt IPv6? And they walk through a number of rules associated or reasons associated with that. And one of those pieces is, well, of course, the number of IPv4 addresses, it's gone. That you cannot apply to Aaron today to get that. Well, the concept is a little bit different. And that is, yes, you can get IPv4 addresses today. You have to go through an auction to do that. If you're looking for a block of addresses, a /20 within the IPv4 environment, that will cost you about $8 per address for you to buy that block of addresses. So that for a very small number of users, 4,000 users, you're looking at somewhere on the order of $32,000. Now, if your budget isn't quite up to that, IPv6 might be for you. Today, for the small, and I'll show you the rate schedule in just a second, for the small users, which is a /40, which equivalents out to some 16 million hosts that you can address, it will cost you $500 a year. Aaron is going to a yearly rather than a one-time fee for address blocks. And that is basically lessons learned from the IPv4 environment, where an address block was assigned and never used, but they could never, no means to withdraw that. So that is one of the pieces that you're looking at today. For those of you that have not looked at IPv6 addressing, a number of years back, somebody did a little bit of analysis and said, okay, how many addresses does IPv6 give you? And they calculated out that a network address, which would be from this line up forward, could be assigned to every square inch of dry earth on the dry land on the earth. And that a full address would basically allow every electrical device on the earth to have its own IP address. So I mean, we're talking about a very, very large number of addresses here. The address block itself is 128 bits long, and our current IPv4 everybody is 32 bits. So it's not twice as big, it's not 4 times as big, it's a lot larger from an address space perspective. The first 16 bits of this is essentially assigned as a region or regional assignment. So Aaron itself has, I believe, I'll show you a slide here in just a second, they have 10 different of those first 16 blocks that they can assign from. So that means, again, the way it's broken up in between North America and the rest of the world, Europe and so forth, these address blocks will will give you a true regional identifier of who owns that address going forward. The next section of the address is basically the who is assigning that, the ISP itself, and then followed by, from the point down from the /32 on down, to an individual customer. So if I take a look at that, of how many in here, how many people have over 10,000 devices addressed in their networks today? Okay. So that means that you all need a very small address block from IPv6. Right, so 10,000 is essentially the smallest block assignment within that environment.
the actual /64, which is the last portion of this, is considered a device. So my device right here will have a /64 assigned to it. You might wonder why. Well, let's take that to a step further of saying I have a single device. What could I want to, identify within that device? Could each of my applications have a unique identifier? Yep. Right. Could each of the elements associated with an application, right? So I have a Visio diagram that has elements in it. Could each of those be assigned an address? Yep. And so it is taking this to the next step of what can you address and what can you connect to takes on an entirely new meaning once we get into this type of an environment. So it's not just an address as we think of network address, but diving into the machines themselves. The MAC address is basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from FA, FF. That's essentially your MAC address. And then you have another 2 octets associated with that will allow you to identify different elements within that machine itself. So when assigning it. And in the environments where I've been looking at, nobody's playing with that at this point. It is just set up as a 0, 0. Yes? Yes, it could, but you have to think about it as TCP still there. Right. But I could essentially at that point say, how about an embedded VLAN identifier within the IP address itself? Could, it would work. Within ARIN today, the schedule fee is shown up here, and so we're looking at a /40 is the smallest address block that will be assigned. So that is, as I said, for those people with over 10,000, this will still solve your addressing problems associated with that. The /20s are at the national level as far as that assignment will be. But it takes IP addressing to a totally different environment when you start to take a look at IPv6. ARIN posted a few guidelines on where they will assign or will allocate IPv6. And if you have gone in for an IPv4 address, how many people have done the paperwork and gotten IPv4 public addresses? Anybody? A couple people? Was it nice and easy, straightforward? Just okay. Yeah, just signatures and all. But the justifications was there. This is it. And I like this one down here. Right? If you don't already have an IPv4, if you don't have a global AS number already defined in multiple service providers, just write a nice story and they'll give you some. Right? So it is not, the allocation of these addresses today is essentially what allocation of IPv4 was in 1990. Really, it is, I need one, please allocate me an address within this environment today, and you will pick up that. But once again, let me, if I may, let me just back up a couple of slides here. When we're talking about a /40, essentially, you'll be picking up this much, well, half of that block of an address grouping is the /40. So you will have 1, 2, 3 octets worth of addresses, which is essentially what you pick up today in a Class B address as a small network. So that's essentially what you pick up within the extremely small, extra small networks themselves. these are the address blocks that Aaron will be allocating from, just for historical sake. So there are the 5 that they have been allocated from the international environment themselves.
Just to give people perspective, the international registrar reserved half of all the total addresses. They're not planning on doing any allocation of half the total available addresses. They've set that aside for, oops, we really screwed up. We still have half the addresses that we can do something with. They don't anticipate that they'll need those for a real long time. And even Aaron, the American registry, has done a similar thing where they took half of what they were given from the international registry and set half of that aside and said, that's for down the road if we ever need it. CEN did something very similar. We took half of our /32, set that aside and said, if we screw this up and give everybody not enough or too much addressing, we've got half of that to redo this whole darn thing. We probably still have too much addressing. It's a lot of addressing.
Okay, so what is being allocated today? I'm just going to go right down to, at the enterprise level, what will be allocated today is a minimum of /40 and a maximum of a /48 as far as the subnet mask is concerned. And this is, the /48 will be on a customer by customer basis of how much traffic or how many users. Now, is set allocated /48s?
We're giving /48 to everybody.
Yep.
If they're bigger, we can do /24 or larger if needed. And even folks that we're giving a /48 to, we've reserved another /48 or /44 for you to grow into, which will effectively quadruple over giving you.
So you're allocating the adjacent address block for them for the future. Yeah. So how are these allocated within, so you get a block, how are these allocated within your environment yourselves? Well, I'm going to start down at the lowest level. If I look at a point-to-point link between 2 devices, right, they will be allocated a /126, which is today the equivalent of our /30 type of arrangement. And that now says that I will have multiple addresses per point-to-point link. And if you go in, this is a point-to-point links as a /126 is a option. The guidelines for assignment of IPv6 is that you put a /64 on a point-to-point link. I haven't quite figured that one out yet, but yeah, the recommendation, yeah, they're looking at this as saying you can do anything you want within this environment because you have so many. Again, from a troubleshooting perspective, having all of that address space on a point-to-point link just doesn't make any sense in where I grew up. So the concept of putting it on as a /126 allocates this, you know the different ends of that link. Subnets themselves, a /64 is the smallest of the subnets that they're recommending today. And that gives you basically 32 bits, that gives you the 48 bits for your MAC address, which is your host address, and the other bits for the subnet identifier itself, which would be equivalent to what we are looking at as a full IP address today. So what does that mean is that your subnetting, if I take a look at this, your subnetting that you're doing today on IPv4 does not have to change the modularity of it. So you can do a one-to-one mapping between your existing IPv4 subnetting and your IPv6 subnetting. You can do a one-to-one mapping within that environment. Now, they're not going to be the same, 192.168 type addresses, but that says that if I am I have one IPv4 subnet, and I will have one IPv6 subnet that is associated with that subnet. So there is a marriage between the two of them with this arrangement today, that you can dual stack and keep the same subnet arrangement that you have within IPv4 today for IPv6. Scott, did I cut you off there? And so that is exactly what I just looked at here. Now, there is an IP6, IP4 arrangement that I can take a look at, and that is taking, instead of having a one-to-one mapping, using my IPv4 as part of my IPv6 arrangement. And there are the NAT translations that are 6-to-4 NAT and a 4 tunneling in IPv6 as well. And tunneling IPv4 addresses within IPv6 uses this convention of saying, I will take the network assigned to me, and I will take the existing IPv4 and slap it right on the end instead of my MAC address. Right? At that point, I convert the entire piece down to hex, and that becomes my IPv6 address. So the conversion or migration from IPv4 to IPv6 can be very, very straightforward. It can either have a one-to-one mapping, or it can have, as shown here, the capability of maintaining that IPv4 architecture going into IPv6. Now, this is just a real quick here. It was on our keynote address this morning, there was there was audience participation. So how many people know what that double, two colons means within this environment? Okay. Go ahead. For everybody else.
It's all zeros in between?
It's all zeros between. And so it is a shorthand for IPv6 that I could have essentially 2001::0600. And what that means is everything else between those two is just zero. And the point being of that is the notation is not only recognized in a human readable format, but also in a machine readable format. So that if I enter in, I'm just getting rid of the zeros within that environment. So if you're addressing stuff and you've been given that address space as your network address, and you want to start with, 001, 002, 003, and so forth on your addressing scheme, right? Everything else is just zeros, leading zeros on that, and they can all be masked out within the addressing scheme themselves. It really doesn't have to type in the whole thing. Okay, now, one of the pieces, the underlying functions of straight IPv4 is the hop by hop or per hop basis for communications. I don't know where the destination is. All I know is my default gateway, my next hop. I send out, I know what its IP address is, I send out this beautiful thing called an ARP. You recognize your IP address and you respond back to my ARP. Okay? IPv4 is set up with that, and that basically is what holds the entire internet together, our IP per hop basis. Right? Within IPv6, we don't use ARP. We use what is referred to as ICMP, neighbor discovery. Very, very similar function to broadcast. You're receiving back the information. It's just not using ARP, because ARP is an IPv4 packet, essentially. And within this environment, right, I send out, and my router, the device, the next hop device, will respond back with its hardware address so that you can now ship off your Ethernet frame to it. The problem associated with that is almost every firewall today and most switches, right, are all set up to allow ARP traffic through, but not ICMP broadcast. So all of a sudden, you deploy, and this is one of the biggest, the stuff that I've seen and the deployments that I've done, and also within, reading the horror stories of IPv6, this is the #1 stumbling block associated with deploying IPv6, are the number of devices that are out there today that basically say, I'm not going to let that through. And it doesn't work. So real simple in that. You have to assure that whatever devices are sitting in between there, between your gateway and your communicating devices, actually will send these broadcast packets through. And it's not ARP, it is ICMP. But one of the last pieces associated with this that I have today is really 2 pieces. What I've covered so far is essentially the fundamentals of getting IPv6 up and running on your machine. It's nothing, most of the hardware today handles it. Most of the hardware today will allow you to provide dual stack service. That means I'm going to have both an IPv4 and an IPv6 operating on the same device. Right? So there isn't really a lot of how do I go about doing that today, because it's there. It's the concept of setting up and using it today. Get an IP address, go forward. And to show you just on how pervasive it is today, right, if you do a straight NS lookup, right, on a Windows machine, I go to the command, I do an NS lookup to Google, right, you will receive their IPv6 address. Right? You go to just about any of the major providers today, you are going to receive back an IPv6 address along with your IPv4 address. So it's out there today. Now, the last of the other piece of this is actually pushing that out through the networks, your networks today. And the first of these pieces I'm going to talk about really OSPF v3 and BGP. OSPF v3 is an upgrade to OSPF, Open Shortest Path First, for IPv6 prefixes. It will interoperate, or it's backwards compatible with v4 address space as well. So you only need to run one protocol, although a lot of people I know are running 2 different protocols. They're running OSPF v2 and v3. And what that allows you to do is advertise the exact same way that OSPF runs for IPv4 for the v6 address space. So this will create a link state database, advertise this traffic around your network. The other piece are ISIS has never not supported IPv6 from day one. But the other piece of this is BGP. So today you have how many? I2 provides you, I think it's like 16,000 or something like that, IPv6s. 1900? Okay. If there is, for my I2, I think it was. It's about the same as the global. Yeah. And so that is coming over a IPv4 BGP connection. So when we talk about BGP, BGP is agnostic to what protocols or what prefixes it will handle. So in today's environment, I only need, if I want to receive from CEN, if I want to receive IPv6 addresses, first off you have to talk to them because they have to set it up on their end. But you can now use your existing BGP peering, put on the IPv6 family, right, and receive IPv6 addresses. So it is the existing, and I guess the point being on this is that your routers today, as long as you've purchased them since 2010 or somewhere in 2005, okay, operate on IPv6. The protocols exist today that run on IPv6. And if you want to start in this environment, the capabilities, it is there and it is operational. And from my point of view, there's really no reason why you shouldn't be preparing for this to moving forward. Because I'm there. Okay. Questions? Yes?
In your experience, in most organizations are using IPv6 just
Yeah. They are just taking the hardware side of things and making it simple on themselves. They're not doing anything other than that.
they're just using they might use static IPv6 interaction.
Yeah. Yeah, just for the point-to-point links and the servers that are not doing the DHCP. Everything else is doing that. From what I'm seeing. What else? Yeah, go ahead.
Just, you know, the class A agency for internal private non-routable address spaces, not non-routable address.
There is a link local address space within IPv6, and I'd love to be able to say this. I'm not going to because I couldn't. But there is a link local IPv6 address space that is not to be advertised back outside. But yes, there's an equivalent of a private address space within this. The NAT, but that is, your machine would have both a link local and a public address rather than having one and doing network address translation. So in today's environment, the address translation is taking place from IPv6 to IPv4, not from 6 to 6. It is more along the lines of you use your link local subnet identifier or you use your public identifier. Does that make sense? It's just, you have a different address for that. Yes? The question is there anything on the internet that I know of today that is only accessible on IPv6?
That's a good question. And probably here in the States, we don't. But we actually had an example with one of our members who was doing a partner project with a university in China. And the Chinese university didn't have an IPv4 addressing. And so what they were doing was natting their IPv6 address onto a shared IPv4 address inside their ISP, going through the Great Firewall of China, coming across the pond, and the performance was atrocious. So they reached out to our university and said, turn on IPv6, come on. And so they reached out to us, we turned it up with them, and all of a sudden they're doing native IPv6 traffic between the two, and the performance was amazing. Partially because it wasn't going through the Great Firewall of China, partially because there wasn't all this other NAT translation and other devices in the path. So here in the States, where most ISPs still have a limited amount of addressing for v4 and everything is still using v4, it's very rare to hear of a case like where there isn't v4 addressing on a service. Over in Asia, it's very common. And probably the most common one here are a lot of our wireless devices with our mobile carriers. They're starting to provide v6 addressing only and do NAT to get to v4 resources.
So they started calling
Yes.
maybe I misunderstood. Well, so it's going. You're getting at that everything will have its own IPv6 almost permanent addresses, someone on MAC address. So there's not going to be Wi-Fi address hidden behind that.
Correct.
It kind of eliminates some security. Like now, if I know the MAC address and I can also determine from the MAC address the type of device it's an iPhone opposed to an HP device, I now have insight into these devices again. Big Brother watching Slack, people who might want to break into access this on iPhones or this MAC address, and now I have an address that's always there. I can't hide behind that anymore.
It is. It makes a different philosophy within the firewalls themselves. But you take a look at that from the perspective of, I now can create a firewall rule that is very simple. Right? Before, if I take a look at my office, is my firewall rule is I will allow all outgoing traffic and I have nothing incoming. Right? I don't rely on that to protect my assets behind that firewall, although they are NATed. Right? You're not going to find anything behind that firewall. Right? But it is the firewall itself, the firewall rules that I have in place that stop sessions from being able to do. And that's essentially, right, that's good security right there. If you're relying 100% on that, you better look at that device, because most likely that NAT device is a full cone NAT device. They will allow anything in to that IP address from the outside.
One more layer that helps a little more protection. How many people don't even have firewalls because we do publish that on the cable box? It's only a great way to do that.
It is.
It's something you need to be aware of when you're deploying IPv6. So there's other options that we don't have to find about the DHCP address that does use that. Right.
Yeah, it's just another way. That's an easy way.
So for Microsoft, we want to compare IPv6 Are you aware of
Haven't played with it. I've not played with it, but use the concept of assigning a from it. You set the mask, just think of that, setting the mask down to assign the entire thing rather than just a subnet would work. But that I'd have to take a look. One more question? Yes.
So that means that you're not addressing, if there is no private addressing here, that's purchased your IP box.
Well, how many people use the 11 block, address block today on the backside? 11.0.0, no. If you want everybody to be able to talk to you, yes. But no, otherwise, this is the exact same thing. Thank you very much.